All right. For those of you, this is your first time, I would love to meet you. And if after the gathering, when we're done, I'm going to be down right over here. Come over, introduce yourself. I'd love to meet you if this is your first time. Love meeting all the new people that are coming. Well, I'm excited about today. I have a couple of things I want to do before we get into the talk today. We need to take the next 7 days, fast and pray for the 49ers. It's the 49ers versus Chiefs. So if you're a Chiefs fan, I apologize. And I have so many things I want to say right now. Do we have any Chief fans in here? I'm just curious. There's a door. I'm kidding. No, it's going to be a fun game. We have Super Bowl next Sunday. And for those of you that were with us when we used to have our evening gathering, we would not have the second gathering just so you could go home and have a Super Bowl party. So now we don't have to cancel church or postpone nothing. You come to church and then go have a fun Super Bowl party, but looking forward to it. And so make sure you're rooting for the 49ers. All right. We actually have an exciting announcement, another one. I wanted to make this one personally. One of the visions of Studio is that this community, that this church would also, one of the things that would be an expression of this house is that it would be an incubator for entrepreneurs. It would be an incubator for people that have incredible ideas that actually can bring about incredible change to humanity. It can bring about economies. It can actually shift regions. It can actually, at the end of the day, impact human beings with their ideas. And for those of you that have been with us any length of time, this is not a new topic or new subject, but this is one of those things that we felt 2024 was the year to kind of begin to move in that direction. So we're making a baby step this coming up this month. If you could put the slide up, we're starting something called Founders and Creators. If you're an explorer, you're a pioneer, you're a maverick, or you consider yourself an entrepreneur. We're starting something. It's starting on February 27th. Save the date in the email this week. If you're not on our regular weekly email, you can get on that by talking to one of our team. We'll tell you how to do that. The sign-ups will be in that email, and they'll be open up for the next few weeks. Stephen Gillum right over here and CJ went to the first gathering. I met with them a few months ago now. And Stephen was saying, what's your heart, what's your vision? And I began to share, there's 3 areas that I'm really passionate about. And we started talking about specifically this entrepreneur space and ideas. And the thing that Stephen kept saying to me, which resonated with me, he said, Eric, I have not been around a community of people that have this many ideas. Ideas that honestly, some of you just need to be pushed off the cliff. And so he said, I want to take ownership of this and create something. And so they developed an 8-week course. This is a baby step in this direction. I think a lot of other things will come from this, but we're going to start with an 8-week course. It'll happen over 10 weeks because 2 weeks we can't meet, but it'll be 8 evenings, Tuesday evening, so it doesn't conflict with our Wednesday night classes. This is a separate thing, 8 weeks long. If this resonates with you, make sure you sign up for it. We're really excited about it. Stephen is so excited about it. His text to me is, I'm so excited, I want to punch somebody in the face. So that's when I tell him, you need to get yourself a punching bag. So anyway, the founders and creators, we're very excited, and this is going to be fun to see what comes out of this. So if you have any questions, go talk to Stephen after this. He'll be around for a little bit, and we'll be announcing this over the next few weeks until the actual start date. Anybody excited about this? Telling you, it's going to be beautiful. So excited. All right. Well, we are going to jump into part 3 of the life of Daniel. And I recognize some of you in this room, you haven't been a part of week 1 or week 2, or maybe you were here for one of them. And I want to just let you know, to save me a lot of time, what would help is for you to go listen to those talks if you haven't yet, because we're actually building and working our way through the book of Daniel, specifically 4 different sections. And we're not going to cover the whole book because the second half of the book is a lot of dreams, a lot of visions, and that's for an entirely different type of talk. We're taking a look at this man who was so deeply embedded in a pretty dark and polytheistic culture. And we're looking at I believe one of the premier examples, apart from Jesus, apart from Paul, and a few others. Daniel, in my mind, is one of the prime examples of how to actually be committed to God and live deep in a dark culture. He proves it over and over, and I'm going to continue to show you today that it's actually possible. So we're going to continue our talk, but I need to give a quick recap. Daniel was alive around 2,500 years ago. He was involuntarily forced into what is called the Babylonian Empire. This Babylonian Empire had a worldview that would be a polytheistic culture, which means this: multiple gods and multiple goddesses. So the spiritual reality of a Babylonian empire was very broad and had multiple gods and multiple goddesses. The thing that's important to understand is the culture was actually specialized in writing and sorcery and witchcraft. They actually had a god that they worshiped that felt that they granted them the ability to write. And they became known even after the Babylonian Empire matured and even collapsed. If you were a Chaldean, which was a certain group of people within the Babylonian Empire, it became synonymous with sorcerers, astrologers, and witch people involved in witchcraft. So this is a culture that's steeped into some pretty dark stuff. And so Daniel is involuntarily brought into this as the Babylonian Empire emerges, brings into that, and he is forced to learn the language, the customs, and the ways of the Babylonian Empire, also known as the Chaldean people. So this is not something Daniel signed up for. He was captured and brought into it. They say he was around 17 years old. And by the time we get to the story today, he's now in his 20s. But as a young man, he's having to learn a language. And we studied in Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 2. Where we left off in part 2, which was a couple weeks ago, we left off on Daniel chapter 2. I need to set the stage for part 3 today with Daniel chapter 2. King Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. And he was the king of the Babylonian Empire. He had this dream, and he tells all of his sorcerers, his astrologers, he tells people involved in witchcraft, he said, I had a dream, give me the interpretation. And they responded and said, tell us the dream, and we'll interpret it for you. And he said, no, I'm not telling you the dream. You have to tell me what dream I had, and then you have to interpret it. And of course they responded, that's impossible. There's no way for us. Which actually kind of tells you the limitation of the demonic realm. That's another conversation. We'll save that for another day. But here we have a people that say it's impossible for us to know what dream you had. We can interpret it, but we can't tell you what dream you had. And Nebuchadnezzar was not okay with that. So he went on a killing rampage. He said, all right, kill them all. Kill all my astrologers, all my sorcerers, just kill them all my magicians. So the guy comes into Daniel's place and said, there was some little moment, and then Daniel said, wait, what are you doing? Because Daniel was a part of that group. In fact, he would actually oversaw the magicians and sorcerers, which is really fascinating. That's a whole other conversation. So he comes to Daniel's house, and Daniel said, wait, what are you doing? He said, King Nebuchadnezzar is so angry that no one can tell him the dream he had and interpret the dream. And Daniel said, wait a second, let me go talk to the king. So Daniel goes to the king and said, King Nebuchadnezzar, what's going on? And the king said, you have to tell me my dream, and you have to give me the interpretation. And Daniel responded with this, I serve a God that can do both. Give me some time. King Nebuchadnezzar goes, okay. So he goes away, and God shows him the dream. And in the dream is a huge image, a statue, an idol that's made out of different material, iron, clay, gold, silver, and bronze. And God revealed the king's dream to Daniel, and then God gave Daniel the interpretation for the dream. So Daniel now goes back to the king and says, this is the dream you had. Imagine that. And imagine hoping you're right. So he tells them the dream, and then he tells them what the meaning of the dream is. And most scholars and most expositors for the last 2,000 years, the more traditional view of what the dream referred to, it was making reference to the next 4 empires that would emerge over the course of the centuries. The first one was the Babylonian Empire, which is the era that we're in. The next one was the Persian Empire. The third one was the Greek Empire. And the fourth one was the Roman Empire, which Jesus shows up. And the belief of that dream, the interpretation of that dream is after the Roman Empire, the kingdom of God will come, and Jesus will introduce a kingdom that will be established forever. So this is a profound dream. What makes it even crazier to me, it wasn't a guy following God that had a dream about the future. You see, God uses all kinds of people to reveal his plans for humanity. And it's amazing how many of them do not even follow God.
That's why I'm so intrigued with culture. I'm looking out there, I'm going, okay, what is culture? Is culture pointing to something that maybe God's not revealing to us, but if we have ears to hear and eyes to see, we'll be able to see what God wants to do in the future. That's a good point right there. Some of you should say amen to that. So that's where we left off. And the king goes, Daniel, you got my dream right, and you got the interpretation. And the last thing Nebuchadnezzar does, he elevates Daniel to even a higher status of authority, and he had more dominion and more reign in the Babylonian Empire. That's where we leave off. So now we're going to jump into Daniel chapter 3. If you want to open your apps, if you want to open your Bibles, whatever one you have, get it open to Daniel chapter 3. Today, we're going to be focusing on a pretty significant moment, but funny enough, it's actually not going to be about Daniel. It's going to be about 3 of his friends. I want to focus on 3 of his friends, primarily because in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel and his 3 friends are synonymous throughout the entire chapter. Everything that happens in chapter 1 is actually involving Daniel and his 3 friends. Their Hebrew names, their Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their Babylonian name that was given to them by the empire was Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego. So here we are introduced to the 3 friends. We met them in chapter 1, but we don't really learn a lot about them until we get to Daniel chapter 3. So read with me in verse 1. We're going to read all the way through verse 6. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high, which for reference is about 90 feet, and 6 cubits wide. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. Jump down to verse 4. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. We'll stop right there. I find it fascinating that after this dream of an image, Nebuchadnezzar builds one. And you notice he built it out of one element, gold. I want you to just take a moment, try to jump into the mind of a king. What kind of self-perception do you have to build an image like this? Talk about slightly egocentric. Talk about a little bit focused on self. Talk about a world that revolves around you. This is the mind that we're dealing with. We're dealing with I would just propose a very broken individual. But nonetheless, he erects this image and he commands the nation, when you hear the music, when you hear the song, fall down and worship. Now the challenge for us, whenever we read stories like this, it's so complex for us in a Western context to understand an Eastern worldview. It's almost impossible for us. We're like, that doesn't make sense. It's not relevant. It doesn't hit home. And so in the Western worldview, we have a very hard time understanding first of all, how is that even a possibility? Because we have nothing in our Western culture that is an image that is erected in the middle of a city. Now, if you go to other parts of the world, it's way more common, and this practice continues today. So we have to do a little bit of work to try to understand what's the parallel or what's the takeaway when you read a story like this. So we're dealing with an image, an object of worship. So we have to address the issue, okay, what is worship? What is an object that we actually submit ourselves to? An idol in a Western framework is easily understood this way. It's anything that you have to check with before you obey God. Anything that you have to check with before you obey, that's considered an idol in your life. Our culture has plenty of things to check with before you obey God. Our culture offers images and idols. It's all undercover. It's all covert. It's all hidden. It's so deeply embedded in our music. It's so deeply embedded in our art, our entertainment, the way that life functions, our economical system, our political system, our religious system. There are so many things in culture today that want you to check with it before you actually obey God. In a relationship with your spouse or friends, especially in a covenant relationship, if I have to check with something else before I do this, that is now an idol in my life. But what's fascinating, if you go a layer deeper into this thinking, you'll recognize that it's not the idol that they're actually worshiping. It's actually the fear is if I don't worship this thing, what will happen? So I want you to take a moment, just check yourself right now. Am I bowing, which means to submit yourself, to check with something? Am I doing that because of the actual thing? Or am I actually scared if I don't do this, what will happen? Time out. Can we have a time out for a second? You know, in a baseball game, the coach comes on the mound and talks with the pitcher. That was happening. I often wonder how much of time we're actually doing things because we're scared if we don't do something, the repercussions, so we just do it. And I want you to check your heart. When you get in culture, you're going to be pulled in a million directions. You're going to be pulled in so many directions that you'll actually do things that you wouldn't do if you didn't have the fear of what would happen if you didn't do it. So this is one of the challenges of living in a culture, and so the parallel for me is understanding. But the other fascinating thing about when you talk about submitting yourself, or in this case, bowing down to an idol, culture is actually the result of what you bow down to. For example, the culture that's in you is existing, it's tangible because of what you submitted yourself to. For example, I'll just use some extremity. If you have a culture of anxiety in your life, it's because you've submitted yourself to anxiety. If you have fear in your life, and that's the culture that you live in, it's because in some way, in some capacity, you've actually bowed down to that thing. Doesn't mean it's not going to be a battle. I'm not talking about battles. I'm just talking about it is king of your life. If the fear of lack, having not enough, is a constant narrative in your story, it's because the culture in you is created because you've submitted yourself to lack and the idea of lack. I want to propose to you the culture that you've created inside of you is essentially a result of what you've submitted yourself to. I could keep digging that hole, and man, it's tempting. Let's keep going. Let's go to verse 8. So we now are aware that there's an idol, and there's a call for worship, there's a call for bowing down, which is that one thing you have to check with before you do what you're supposed to do. And now we have a situation where these three guys did not actually bow down. And this is where we're going to pick up the story in verse 8. At this time, astrologers, now just for reference, astrologers is the Chaldeans. These are the experts in astrology and magician and magic and sorcery. At this time, some astrologers come forward and denounce the Jews. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. The next point I want to extract out of this, you have to understand when you're in culture, someone else wants your spot. The tension here is now palpable. Sometimes when you read these stories, man, God just elevated Daniel. He elevated Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego. Everybody was just happy about that. In fact, the exact opposite happens. You have to understand that when you're in culture, if you don't feel tension, if you don't feel opposition, and if you don't feel resistance, it means you're going in the same direction as culture. It actually means you're going with the flow. You're now so deeply embedded, you can't tell what's right, what's wrong, what's up, what's down. You're now completely been enveloped by the culture. So this fantasy idea of getting in culture and really bringing the kingdom, the danger side of it, the shadow side of it is you get so swallowed up in culture, you actually move to a place, because who likes tension? Who likes resistance? Who likes opposition? Not many. Everyone has a different threshold. So sometimes when we get into spaces where there's so much resistance, our goal is to get out of that. The danger with that is you'll now be swallowed up in culture. So I want to tell you, if you're not feeling tension, and you're not feeling opposition, and you're not feeling resistance, you might just be a part of it now. But here's the challenge. We are taught in modern day, when you are in culture, and when you feel that, get out. I want to approach you, no, it's not a matter of getting out. You're just going to have to be okay with tension. You're going to have to be okay with resistance, and you're going to have to be okay with opposition. It's a comfortable spot for you to learn to get comfortable with. So these astrologers come up to the king, we found some people. And I want to propose to you, this wasn't like, oh, they found some people. They were looking for a moment to expose these three guys. But what's even more interesting to me as I dive into the story is, if we find out that these three men, including Daniel, at this point you have to ask the question, how are they able to sustain their commitment to not bowing down? I believe the answer is found in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. It says, Daniel purposed in his heart. And when you read that verse, it's actually including his three friends. So that statement is not dedicated only to Daniel. It actually involves his three friends. They purposed in their heart they would not eat the king's food in chapter 1. So I want to expand this for you a second. The word purpose, the root word means to lay, to set down, to arrange, to fix, to stand, to install, to establish. So the word purpose actually means to make a commitment to not move. The challenge is, we also call this vows. I make a vow to not do X. We are taught in today's culture that if the vow doesn't suit you, adjust the vow to fit whatever emotion or desire that you actually have. Vows are not designed to be negotiable. Whatever you're doing that is against the vow is what becomes negotiable. So for example, my covenant to my wife, on the day we got married, we exchanged vows. This is before the day where you wrote your own. You just got that traditional vows. How many old school? You got the in sickness and health, that one. Now everybody's writing the cool, crafty, Etsy, Pinterest vows. Like, I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know that was legal. I thought you had to follow this traditional vow system. So anyways, so this vow that Candace and I made, what we exchanged on that day, that commitment, we purposed in our heart that if anything comes against that vow, or I have a desire to negotiate the vow because of something I want to do, this is not negotiable. This becomes negotiable. And we're taught in today's day that if it doesn't fit your desires, or you don't feel like it, we start adjusting and negotiating our vows and our commitments. We start making it fit our lifestyle. When you are in culture, you have to make a vow, and anything that threatens that vow becomes negotiable, not the vow itself. You guys still with me? Okay, we're going to keep moving. Let's go down to verse 16. So they've been told on. They now are brought before the king. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. It's a pretty profound moment, because here we have these guys that look at the king and they say, listen, we're not bowing down no matter how many times we go over this. But I want to just take a moment and highlight something they said. They said, we know God can deliver us. However, if he doesn't, we're still not bowing down. This is profound. This is almost a foreign concept in today's context. What is happening here? They have a theology. What is a theology? It's your belief in God. It's your beliefs and values that surround this idea of God. That's your theology. Their theology was God is going to deliver us. But if he doesn't, our theology stays the same. What we often do today is we reduce our belief in God down to our human experience. So we do things like that God is my provider. So we expect him to provide. And guess what? When he doesn't, or what you wanted to happen doesn't happen, many people adjust their theology. God is not a provider. Or you create nuance to the theology. You say, well, maybe he wasn't in the mood today. Maybe I did something wrong. And all of a sudden, we've opened ourselves up to a world of theology that has gotten off the main principle that God is actually a provider. God is my healer. And when you don't get healed, what happens? Do you change your theology? Do you lower it down to your experience? Oh, God doesn't want to heal me because, and we come up with the rest of the equation. I'm not blessed because. This is the danger, is when you use your human experience to lower the standards of God to your experience. You basically are creating your own God. Your experience becomes a God in your life. So in this moment, when they say, God's going to set us free, but if he doesn't, it doesn't change our view of God. My challenge to you, this is the great human principle. Following Jesus, if God doesn't come the way that you want him to come or expect him to come, ask yourself this question: does it change my view of him? In today's age, you're told, change your view of him. Adjust it. Water it down to your experience. And they choose not to. It's a beautiful moment. I want you to also keep in mind is they threw him in the fire. They threw him in this blazing furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar was quite irate. He was furious. And he take the temperature of the furnace 7 times hotter. It was so hot that the guys that threw him in there died from the heat. But when they go in, they're fine. But then the scriptures tell us there was a 4th person in the fire. Now, the Christian, our interpretation of that, oh, that's got to be Jesus. It's the Son of God. But when you actually look at the original language, it's Son of Gods. Why is that important to highlight? Now, you can still hold on to the idea that it was Jesus standing in the fire, which makes sense. It fits we love that. Like, we sing songs about that. Jesus is with me in the fire, which I believe is true. But the actual language does not say that. It says Son of Gods. Why? Because their perspective in a polytheistic culture, they have multiple gods. They didn't have this idea of a concept of a God. They had gods and goddesses. Why is this important? Because you're going to interact with people that have no language for what they're seeing. Some of you hear from God all the time. You're going to be called a psychic. And you should be totally fine with that. Why? Because that's their language. And we spend so much time auto-correcting culture. Editing, I know you're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to do that. No, let them say whatever it is and trust that the power of God will eventually work their way into their worldview. We're so busy trying to change the worldview overnight. Culture is a long game. It is not overnight, and it's not in a 12-month calendar. It is a long game. And when you understand the context of what's taking place here, the idea of a God that is more powerful than all their gods has now been introduced to their worldview. This is a huge step, especially when Nebuchadnezzar said, all right, here's my new rule. If anybody does not believe in their God, I'm going to cut them to pieces. That's what you do with a dictator. You just control it all. And you chop people up that don't fit what you want. You have to understand the world that you live in does not have your view of the world. So stop auto-correcting it. Let it be absorbed. So this is the powerful moment here. When they recognize the Son of God is in the fire, they had no idea what that is. They just saw a 4th person in there. Now, is it Jesus? Perhaps. And that's a whole nother conversation, but you'll be amazed at how many, the language says Son of Gods. So guess what? Sometimes the world doesn't think it's the only God, but now they'll add one God to their list of gods. That's a big step in the right direction. Are you with me? Imagine when you have someone that has no view of God, considered an atheist or even an agnostic, and all of a sudden they warm up to the idea of something transcendent is doing something. And you're like, well, that's God. Just leave that out. Let them sit in that for a moment. We are so rushing to get people to just say the words we want them to say instead of letting their soul, their mind, their heart absorb this whole new possibility of maybe there is something out there. Maybe it's not the universe. Maybe there's something out there. And we're like, well, that's the Bible, and the God says this, and Jesus says this. I just want to say, take a breather. Let them just marinate in that for a little while. Just let them absorb that. And trust that God will actually do the work inside of them. Another important thing to keep in mind is whatever throws you in the fire will get consumed, but you won't get consumed. All right, let's move on. Let's go to verse 30, and we're going to start landing this thing. In verse 30, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego in the province of Babylon. Stop right there. Just because you got promoted doesn't mean revival is going to happen. It's worth mentioning. Like, oh man, now it's going down. No. You just got promoted. And just steward that really well. And we can read the rest of the story so we can see what happens next. But I just want to check. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It doesn't mean that God's not going to show up. It just recognize God is promoting you in your world. He's actually promoting you so you can be a conduit, a funnel, if you will, of the kingdom being demonstrated in that particular context. Let God do the rest. You just simply do what you are to do. I want to end with this. What I love about this story, so many things, and that was just a sliver of things that I would love to just share with you. But what I want you to walk away with is find some friends and change the world. That's what I love about this story. You got 3 guys, and they're like, let's change the world. Let's do this thing. Instead of being isolated, instead of being alone, they banded together and they changed the world. You are so much better when you find friends, you find your people, and you say, you know what, let's conquer this thing. Let's do this thing. You're so much better. Some of my most deepest, most meaningful relationships are not because we had a lot of coffee dates and we went on bike rides together. Those are all important. But don't limit your deep relationships to a cup of coffee. Find relationship where you'll take on the hardest thing in culture and you go after it. Find the conflict, the tension, the opportunities in culture and change the world. It's in these moments that we begin to recognize that I got to surround myself. And I want to challenge you, surround yourself with people that fit your future, not your past. Who you surround yourself will tell you exactly where you're going in life. And some of us are still surrounding ourselves with people that are holding us back and going the opposite direction of where you're actually supposed to go. So find people that fit your future. Find people, find friends that we're going to change the world. And some of my deepest relationships in life are the ones that we gone to war. We lost some battles, but we won some too. Can you imagine what it was like for these 3 guys to come out of the fire? I don't even think they said that was hot. Like, did you feel anything in there? I didn't feel anything. You see the other guy? I don't know who that was, but that was some guy. I think they were literally amazed. And imagine what it was like to walk down the streets after this procession. I think the crowds parted. I think if they had their head down, their heads are now up. Their chest is out, and they definitely had a strut. Had one hand in a pocket, a latte in the other, and they just kind of walked right on through Babylon like it was theirs. You see what it does? It bonds you. When you change the world with friends, it bonds you for life. And you don't see them for a few months, and when you look at each other, you pick up right where you left off. That's the beauty of changing the world. So take your friendship past coffee dates and bike rides and dinners. Take on something in culture that needs the kingdom, and you'll find a friend for life. Why don't you stand?